I stood on the border between Turkey and Syria watching ambulances being painted black so they wouldn't be recognised as being an ambulance. I think that was the first time in my life I'd ever seen that happen.
Welcome back to the PJ Pod. I'm senior clinical reporter David Lipanovic, and that was Saleha Hassan describing one of her experiences as an emergency medical doctor working in a war zone.
When you have a hostile territory, you will either lose the workforce because they've been killed or injured, or you will lose them because their ability to remain has become untenable.
Sadly, Saleha's experience of being targeted as a healthcare worker is just one of many challenges faced by the pharmacists and pharmacy organisations operating in war zones. These challenges can take many forms, from the direct dangers associated with working in areas of conflict to the comparatively mundane yet complicated logistical issues associated with importing medicines. And that's what we'll explore in today's episode. Please note, the following includes discussions of war and injury that may be distressing to some listeners, with stories from pharmacists working in Sudan, Ukraine, and Gaza. We start with Saleha, who's visited numerous conflict zones and who's currently doing her PhD at Cambridge looking at the impact of attacks against healthcare in war zones. In the places that you were working in, can you describe to us some of the challenges that you faced?
I think the main thing was working in an environment that was hostile to healthcare, which has led to my interest in studying the area. Being in a space where healthcare was being targeted, where you had to disguise the fact that you were a healthcare worker. The second one is being in an environment where there are very complicated injuries that patients are suffering because war creates complex injuries, polytrauma, also exacerbation of chronic illnesses that would otherwise be managed quite straightforwardly, becoming rather complex and extreme forms of that chronic condition, and not having the skill set or the medications required to treat them that we would manage quite easily and straightforwardly here in the UK within our NHS.
What medicines were typically in high demand during these conflicts?
Well, in high demand, painkillers, adequate pain relief was a real problem. I had a paediatric mass casualty situation that I was part of when a Syrian Air Force pilot dropped a thermal bomb on a school, and we had a mass casualty situation of about 28 children who were severely burned, and the challenge was having adequate analgesia to manage their rather severe pain from burns. We didn't have any opioids, and it was all very basic analgesics. That was challenging.
While stories of school bombings are harrowing, the desperate need for medicine isn't always for acute care.
The common concern I've heard so many times is the plight of diabetics and insulin. Obviously, insulin needs its own sort of storage. It needs to be kept cool, and electricity keeps going off. So it's very, very hard to keep medications cool. And people now are living in horrendous conditions in camps with no electricity, with regular flooding from rain. It's a dire situation. Imagine having an illness that you're then trying to keep on top of in those circumstances. That in itself is horrendous. And also we have other chronic conditions. Renal conditions are really causing a great deal of angst, as we can imagine. The concern of people who are on dialysis, on how they're going to be getting their dialysis and becoming extremely unwell because they're not getting their dialysis. You know, everything that we have functioning here and that keep our hospitals busy are basically not functioning there.
Under normal circumstances, importing medicines and resources from manufacturers in different countries follows a clear path. often using wholesalers who then delivers products to various hospitals and healthcare facilities. But in war zones, the path from manufacturer to wholesaler to pharmacy to patient isn't always that straightforward.
So, as we're seeing in Gaza right now, their humanitarian trucks are being blocked from entering by Israeli settlers who feel that Gaza shouldn't have humanitarian aid. Intimidation of humanitarian aid going into in an area of need is taking place. Within Syria, there had to be a UN resolution passed to try to unblock the borders that had been blocked by Syria to let medicines in. So when you have these state-controlled blocks on the borders, that's a key area to explain why medications are not entering an area of need.
Besides the medicine supply problem, Saleha also describes horrendous conditions faced by medical staff treating the wounded.
When you have a hostile territory, you will either lose the workforce because they've been killed or injured, or you will lose them because their ability to remain has become untenable. As I saw in Libya, doctors and nurses who had helped care for the war wounded, if they were the war wounded from the opposition to the government, their names were put on lists and government officials and military personnel were going door to door looking for them. So these professionals had to go into hiding. So that can also impact the workforce within a healthcare setting. I think also that in Syria, for example, part of the punishment towards healthcare workers was also to remove them from their registration, so removing their license to practice.
These challenges of limited access to medicines, leading to complications of chronic conditions, seems to be a common theme for those living in conflict zones. In Sudan, there is an ongoing civil war between two factions of the military government, which started back in April 2023. The conflict began in the capital, Khartoum, and forced many people to leave their homes and flee from the city. With no place to live, many of these people were placed in tents for internally displaced people, also known as IDP camps. After just 14 days of fighting, the UN tweeted that only 16% of health facilities were fully operational. Maria Alejandra Martin Escalona, a humanitarian pharmacist working for Doctors Without Borders, who is currently working in South Sudan, described for me the collateral damage forced upon the residents in these areas.
These IDP camps are normally very crowded, and you find a big number of people living in improvised houses or tents without access to basic services like clean water, latrines, waste management. And all of this just increases the possibility of developing different diseases.
Maria's role is to provide primary health care in these areas, usually based in medical centres set up inside these IDP camps. She told me that previously the most vulnerable people, such as children and pregnant women, were prioritised for medicines. But due to the increasing needs of the general population in Sudan, centres are now providing medicines to everyone.
The main medications we use are antimalarials, as malaria is one of the main morbidities in the country, as well as analgesics and antipyretics to treat fever, which is one of the main symptoms for many diseases, including malaria. We also use some antibiotics for respiratory or urinary tract infections, oral rehydration salts for the treatment of patients with waterborne disease, and we support as well with the treatment of cholera. We also support vaccinations campaigns when these are needed, as it's very common, like in these settings, to have outbreaks of this preventable disease due to the low vaccination coverage, and in the population in general, but also in these IDPs or refugee camps, they can spread very fast. The main challenges we face in these areas are especially regarding importation of drugs and medical materials, and the movement of these items both into the country and inside of the country.
Medical care in Sudan was particularly affected by the bombing of pharmaceutical factories in Khartoum. In an open letter to the UK government from the Sudan Doctors Union, it said that civilians were left requesting important life-saving medicines like insulin over social media platforms. The letter said, quote, "The short and the medium-term impact of the damage of this armed conflict on the screening programs, vaccination programs, antenatal care, malnutrition and TB care, amongst others, is expected to be really severe," end quote. With a weakened health system, Maria adds that she's also battling against an increased risk of encountering fake medicines.
We want also to reduce the risk of having counterfeit products, especially in those countries or those settings where there is a weakened health system. It's more likely that these items, these products, counterfeit products, enter the country, and we can prevent this because we buy from known and validated sources. So this reduces the probability of having this type of products. Another reason why we import is because normally in conflict areas there are ruptures in the market and there are interruptions in the supply of goods. So this makes it very likely that we don't find the items that we need or in the quantities that we need.
In March this year, the UK government announced that it would nearly double its humanitarian aid for Sudan and called for restrictions that are preventing aid from reaching those who need it to be lifted. The money includes nearly £8 million to support refugees in South Sudan, where Maria works. In the face of conflict, pharmacists are going to incredible lengths to make sure medicines get to the people who need them on the front line. Mark Koziel, the chair of the Pharmacy Defence Association and Secretary General of the Employed Pharmacists of the European Union, or EFU for short, actually went to Ukraine to find out how the UK can help get medicines to where they need to go.
When you're looking at a conflict situation, it's not like, you're going to Scotland for the weekend and you're driving up the M6. There are all sorts of difficulties that you need to overcome. So that meant that we had to get diplomatic clearance both in Poland and in Ukraine to make sure that we could actually do the journey at all. The customs officials had to be notified. We managed to get security clearance. It took them 3 weeks before they would even talk to us at the PDA and at EFU, because there's a lot of wise guys involved in conflict crises. There's a lot of crooks and criminals and bandits who seek the support of the public to try and raise funds for this issue or that issue, and the next thing you know, the money kind of vanishes and disappears. And already the Ukrainians had seen examples of some of their famous people trying to raise funds to help their fellow Ukrainians, and it turned out that those funds were being distributed in very strange and unusual ways. And the amount of security during a wartime situation and the context of that security changes in a way that you won't see, because we live in a peaceful country here. So whereas there might be a lorry travelling along the road with medical items to a hospital, and that's seen to us as a normal thing, to others it's seen, well, if we steal that, we might be able to feed our family, we might be able to feed our village. So there are huge additional security problems that start to get introduced in a wartime situation that perhaps wouldn't have happened in a normal time.
As difficult as it was, Mark finally gained diplomatic clearance to enter Ukraine, only to encounter an even bigger problem: poor access to medicines.
There's certain medicines that are more suited for wartime injuries. So medicated bandages, for example, transfusions, specific pain-killing agents that are given by infusion, muscle relaxants, that kind of thing. Suddenly you have a war situation, and the stocks that you might hold, which might represent 5% of your total medicine stock holding, disappear very, very quickly indeed, because there's a huge, big increase in demand coming from that particular area. So they run out of those types of medicines very, very quickly. Now, in addition to that, where they were storing the medicines was a problem, because those places were being destroyed. And I actually saw evidence of destruction where there were no military targets there were no soldiers based there. Some of these places were pharmacies. Some of these places were hospitals. Some of these places were wholesalers.
To help secure medicine supplies to Ukraine, the UK has committed to sending millions of pounds worth of aid. Most recently, the Department of Health and Social Care said in April that they've sent another package of life-saving medical equipment, including ventilators, pumps, and patient monitors worth £2 million. But Mark says previous packages of medical aid from the West, not just from the UK, haven't been very helpful.
We met with some of the health ministry officials and they said, look, we're really grateful to the West for helping us, but please don't help us by sending us rubbish. I was in a military hospital at the time, and in the corridor of this military hospital, the corridor was full of boxes all the way to the ceilings of cardboard boxes full of respirators. And I was walking along with the chief medical officer and I said, so what's with these respirators? Do the soldiers come back from the front with breathing difficulties or what's going on? And he said, no. He said, the Americans are helping us with the war effort and they've sent us all of their leftover respirators from the COVID crisis. We don't need them. We don't want them, but we've got them. So we're storing them in corridors. And he opened a few doors and they were in rooms, full rooms, either side of the corridor as well. And I asked them the question, what had Boris Johnson done? Because he was the Prime Minister at the time when I went the first time. And they said, we love Boris Johnson. We think he's a superhero. But a couple of weeks ago, we received from the British government 2 very, very large lorries full of paracetamol with 2 weeks short-dated supply on them. And we're now spending time with flip charts and pens trying to work out how we're going to dispose of them in an environmentally friendly way. I subsequently came back and did some research, and it's not just America and the UK, the whole of the West. And it tends to be a conflict zone magnet. They greenwash their humanitarian credentials by sending rubbish to conflict zones that the conflict doesn't need. I took photographs of literally mountains of cardboard boxes, mountains and mountains and mountains of cardboard boxes. And these boxes contained trousers, they contained tents, baby food, sandwiches, food, medicines. Some of the boxes that I saw had been ripped open were medicines that members of the public had got from their local pharmacy, not that they even purchased, but they'd got on prescription, propranolol that they'd got, Mrs. Jones, 2 to be taken 3 times a day in a white NHS box sent to the Ukrainian border to help the Ukrainians. Now, one of the Polish government requests when I went to speak to the Polish government about we were planning a campaign, they said, Mark, if you're going to do this, please try and educate the public not to send any more boxes because we're now having to use bulldozers. There's rats running about all over the place. We are unable to manage these boxes on the borders. Whole areas of the borders are full of boxes. And they were even thinking that they probably have to set fire to an awful lot of this because there was just no way of being able to manage. And some people were treble wrapping it with gaffer tape just to make sure they got there safely. But nobody was giving any thought as to what happens to the boxes when they actually arrive at the border. So the answer is there need to be collective campaigns where we're asking members of the public to donate funds, not to donate medicines.
With no cold chain and no audit trail of where the medicines had been, Mark says most of what's been sent can't be used.
You can't give to human beings things that you don't even know if they are falsified or whether they're genuine or what they are. So often governments, members of the public and others don't understand that medicines are not normal items of commerce. There has to be a proper audit trail of items. So this isn't just a problem for Ukraine. This is a problem that exists in other conflict zones where members of the public and even governments and NGOs have great difficulty in sending medicines through properly in a way that they can be used by humans.
What Mark describes here is the negative impact of the traditional push approach, which often sees government and NGOs send excess supplies which aren't actually needed. Instead, Mark stresses the importance of the pull approach, which sees aid to crisis zones carefully coordinated by pharmacists. These issues of push and pull were highlighted in posters set up in pharmacy windows across Europe.
And when the invasion started, our members in Ukraine contacted EFU and said, what can EFU do to help? And EFU being a regional organisation for the region of Europe, we figured that we could create a European solution. And we created a campaign which meant that we put pharmacy posters up across all of the pharmacy windows across the continent of Europe that were all linked to a central website. And depending on which country you were in, when you clicked the QR code as a member of the public that walked past a pharmacy, it told the story about the reason why medicines are now really, really short in Ukraine. And it told the story as to why specialist medicines can't be sent in cardboard boxes to the border of Poland and Ukraine, because there was a huge, big trend of members of the public doing that. And it told the story that medicines are specialist items, they're not normal items of commerce. So that was the campaign that we set up. Me being the Secretary General of EFU, effectively got the job of running and setting up that campaign. And it resulted in me being required to not only run the campaign, but to go over with at least the first consignment of medicines to make sure that it got to the target destination in Ukraine.
So rather than sending unneeded medicines, what can well-meaning pharmacists, members of the public, or even organisations do to help instead?
If we want to make a real difference to a large number of people, we have to work as a profession, nationally and internationally. So the first thing that we need to do as pharmacists here in the UK is to persuade our national pharmacy bodies to have a position and join an international coalition of pharmacy organisations that have a humanitarian function, so that we can coordinate our affairs. The big European lesson to me has been that £4.5 million that we've raised hasn't been raised in one country. It's been raised by 12 countries. Some countries thought that their effort was insignificant and minuscule, but when you add it all together, it makes a huge difference. So getting national pharmacy organisations to jump onto the programme is the first thing that we can do. The second thing that we can do as individuals, and I'm talking more about the Medicines 2 campaign, which relates about appealing to the public from one of the strengths that we have in pharmacy. We have lots and lots of community pharmacies. We have hospital pharmacies as well. We have GP practices, places where we can display posters that members of the public can read. Now, we all know that in primary care, in community pharmacy in the UK, more members of the public go into a community pharmacy each week than the rest of primary care put together. That's a really great place to get a message out to the public. A poster in the window that says, in this case, it's been medicines to Ukraine, but it could be medicines to Palestine, medicines to Syria, medicines to wherever there is an international crisis, is read by millions of people.
Mark also points out that at present, the UK is one of the most poorly prepared countries to support pharmacists working in conflict zones. But for those who are interested in volunteering their services, Mark says plans are in motion to improve this and expects that within the next 18 months, pharmacists will be able to join humanitarian programs overseas. The Medicines 2 campaign has been hugely successful in Ukraine and is now serving as a blueprint for sending medicines to other conflict zones. However, in Gaza, Mark says the Medicines 2 campaign has proved too challenging. He said the current situation is too hostile, and with the borders closed and the absence of regional organisations or infrastructure to receive or distribute medicines, it's yet to be a feasible option. And he has a point. According to an article published in February 2024 by Time magazine, it's estimated that over 450 healthcare workers have been killed in Gaza. As Mark alerted, there was a strong need for pharmacists and other healthcare workers to work together as a profession internationally. One organisation that exists to form just such international collaborations is the International Pharmaceutical Federation, or FIP for short. Catherine Duggan is the Chief Executive Officer.
Well, our role is manifested in a couple of ways. Our role to support anyone, anywhere about anything is predominantly through a member organisation in that country. So if there's an organisation that represents pharmacists and pharmaceutical scientists and pharmacy educators in a nation, we would seek to work with that organisation. Some countries don't have a member organisation or a representative or advocacy body. Maybe they have a university, so we work with them. But some countries don't have any organisation that represents them individually. And in that case, we support them on an individual basis.
Catherine says that FIP has a foundation to help raise funds. However, she states that this needs to be tightly controlled to ensure that they're distributed to proper organizations and used appropriately. She also says FIP needs to consider advice from the United Nations and the World Health Organizations when starting fundraising initiatives, particularly if there's no way to get medicines or money into their country.
There's another thing that's really been useful, which is about putting colleagues on the ground in touch with other colleagues on the ground so that they can share experiences together. But when something is really raw or happening in real time, that can be impossible. You need to wait for people to realise when they've got some space. And I think that's the humanitarian response. You can be quite emergency and acute in your response. We can do anything quickly, but to do the longer term support and advice, I would argue there's a lot more needed.
What sort of support is FIP providing in the situation in Gaza at the moment?
FIP would be partnering up with our member organisations neighbouring Gaza and Palestine if there was any way that we could get medicines in there. But at the present time, there isn't, and we wouldn't put our colleagues in Jordan or Egypt or anywhere in that position either. So sometimes the politics prevents you from doing what you need to do. Sometimes the politics prevents you from doing what you want to do. In FIP, we do what our members want us to do. So I would say we need to really temper the explanations for the individuals in, let's say, the UK, so that they're not doing something that the country isn't ready for or they haven't been asked for. And explaining that whole piece about the push-pull is really important. It's really important. People do things out of the best intentions, but sometimes it causes more work, more trouble. And that's why at FIP we do tend to do what we are asked to do within a political context. I think we run the risk of feeling very helpless about this. And I think there's something, I'm going to sound strange when I say this, but there is something about that we are helpless, especially if we're trying to be non-political and we're trying to be non-judgmental, which I think is really important for FIP, but also for us on the ground. If we're going to help pharmacists in a nation undergoing a huge conflict, we have to understand that there might be complexities in that country or with that individual.
Catherine said that currently the FIP member organisations in Gaza don't have the infrastructure to raise and distribute funds during the conflict, and that sending medicines isn't in the usual remit of the FIP. She told me that each conflict is different and there may be political barriers which can limit the level of aid and funds that organisations like FIP can provide, but says it's important to be patient and remain accessible for when restrictions are lifted. She also pointed out that there are other organisations with established infrastructure and pathways to send funds or humanitarian aid. One organisation that has been able to pass the Israeli border is Medicines Aid to Palestine, or MAP for short. MAP, which is in partnership with organisations such as the Palestine Red Crescent Society and the World Health Organization, remains as one of the only international organisations working to provide humanitarian aid and medical services in Gaza. Fitruk Shaltut, MAP's Gaza director, sent us a statement over email saying that they've coordinated with the Egyptian Red Crescent Society to deliver $3.1 million worth of food and medical items including antibiotics, intravenous paracetamol and saline through the Rafah border and the Karim Shalom crossings into Gaza. She said they'll be sending a further $1.5 million worth of medical supplies and shelter items in the coming weeks. However, she echoes Catherine's concerns on the difficulty in transportation. As all entries of goods and supplies are controlled by Israel, delivery is sometimes slow and far below what's needed by hospitals and the population. She told me that before October, prior to the conflict, around 500 trucks used to be allowed into Gaza on a daily basis. But at the beginning of April, the number of trucks allowed through was limited to less than 200 per day. In the meantime, Mark encourages pharmacists to speak out and increase awareness of the conflict.
One important thing that I discovered on this journey, because it has been a journey for me, and that is that, we become pharmacists because we want to help members of the public. That's what causes us to be a pharmacist in the first place. And every day, us pharmacists are helping members of the public in a pharmacy, on a ward in a hospital, in a GP practice. We need to think seriously about how we can work together to help patients halfway around the world.
And with that message, we've come to the end of this episode. Of course, we'll provide links to information on the Medicines 2 campaign led by Mark and his team in the show notes. For pharmacists who are interested in volunteering, there will be a link to MSF Doctors Without Borders in there also. A massive thank you to our guests, Saleha, Maria, Mark and Catherine, for coming on the podcast and for the incredibly brave work you do in the most challenging settings around the world. You've been listening to the PJ Pod. Please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. And let us know on social media what your thoughts are on the episode and what you'd like to hear more of in the future using the hashtag PJPod. And just before we let you go, if you're interested in joining the Royal Pharmaceutical Society to access a range of member benefits including the Pharmaceutical Journal's news, features and learning resources, you can do so for the equivalent of just 60p a day. Just search RPS membership to find out more. Until next time, goodbye.